In suburban neighborhoods, where identical houses line the streets and seasonal decorations come and go in predictable waves, there is always one home that dares to do things differently. On this particular block, as December drew near, that home belonged to a man who genuinely loved the holidays. Not for show, not for competition, but simply for the joy of it. His house stood as a warm beacon amid the chill of winter, strung with twinkling lights and filled with the sound of cheerful music that drifted into the cold night air. The songs he chose were classics, familiar carols that had been played for generations. They weren't blasted at deafening volumes. They were carefully balanced, filling the yard with melody and setting a festive tone for neighbors walking their dogs or children sledding down the small hills nearby. Yet in every neighborhood, there always seems to be one person who finds joy in others intolerable. She was known quietly as the complainer of the street, a woman who kept her blinds drawn tight, who seemed to find flaws in everything from the placement of garbage cans to the way lawns were trimmed. She had a knack for transforming ordinary moments into grievances, and this holiday season was no different. The music, she decided, was unacceptable. It didn't matter that it played only during reasonable evening hours, or that many families enjoyed hearing it while passing by. To her, it was an intrusion, an offense that needed immediate correction. At first, the man assumed it was a minor irritation, perhaps a passing comment she would make and then forget. But her complaints were not whispered in passing. They were sent in formal emails to the Homeowners Association, filed with detailed timestamps, and copied to neighbors in a transparent attempt to rally support. She insisted that the music disrupted her evenings, that it echoed into her home and disturbed her peace. She claimed it was unnecessary noise, unbecoming of a community that prided itself on quiet uniformity. The irony, of course, was that the street was rarely quiet. Lawnmowers hummed on weekend mornings, leaf blowers roared through fall afternoons. Children shouted gleefully during summer games, cars with modified exhausts rattled by late at night. Yet, none of these interruptions seemed to warrant her attention. Only the holiday music, with its cheerful notes and warm harmonies, became the centerpiece of her campaign. Her persistence grew quickly. She began pacing the sidewalk in front of his yard during the evenings, arms folded tightly, as if her very presence could shame him into compliance. She cornered neighbors in their driveways, lamenting how unbearable the sound had become. And soon the HOA, never one to miss an opportunity to assert control, issued its first letter. It was worded in vague but threatening language, citing noise guidelines and community standards, reminding him that all residents were expected to be considerate of their neighbors. The man could have folded then. Many do when confronted with official letters and neighborly hostility. He could have turned off the music, packed away the speakers, and returned to a quieter holiday. But his love for the season was more than decorative. It was deeply rooted in memories of his family, traditions passed down, and the simple belief that joy is meant to be shared. Surrendering would have meant erasing that spirit, not only for himself but for the children who stopped to listen, the parents who smiled as they walked by, and the elderly couple down the street who said it reminded them of Christmases long ago. Instead of retreating, he waited. He wanted to see just how far she would go, how determined she was to strip joy from the block, and she did not disappoint. Her campaign became louder than the music itself. She filed additional complaints, escalating each one as though it were an emergency. She claimed the music carried into the late night hours, though it never played past 9. She insisted it was commercial in nature, because it used outdoor speakers, as if his yard were a concert venue instead of a decorated lawn. By the second week of December, her frustration had grown so exaggerated that even the HOA board began to hesitate. They sent a second letter, stronger this time, threatening fines if the disturbance continued. They warned of further disciplinary actions, citing bylaws that most residents had never read and few even knew existed. Her influence pressed down like a heavy hand, attempting to smother the spirit of the season. But while her anger burned, something else was happening quietly among the neighbors. The man began receiving notes slipped into his mailbox, anonymous but kind, thanking him for the music. Children left little drawings of Christmas trees and stars at his doorstep. A few neighbors made a point of stopping by just to tell him how much they appreciated the cheer. He realized then that the woman's complaint was not the voice of the street, but the loudest voice in the room. And loudness alone does not equal majority. Still, the HOA's letters carried weight. The threat of fines was real, and the possibility of legal action loomed in the background. He knew he couldn't simply ignore them indefinitely, but he also knew that compliance meant giving her exactly what she wanted, a complete erasure of joy. And so he began to plan. What if, instead of quieting down, he went bigger? What if, instead of removing the music, he turned it into something undeniable, something no letter could contain? Her complaint, after all, was about noise. But what if the sound wasn't just his speakers, but something far grander, something that transcended the ordinary rules of neighborhood disputes? An idea took shape, bold and outrageous, but also perfectly poetic. If she wanted to complain about holiday music, then she would truly have something to complain about. Not a simple playlist drifting from a pair of speakers, but a full performance, live, powerful, and impossible to ignore. The thought lingered in his mind as the days ticked closer to Christmas. He researched quietly, looking into local choirs, community groups, and professional singers. He discovered that many choirs performed throughout the season, often traveling to malls, churches, and even private events. What if, he wondered, he brought one of them here? Not to a stage, not to a concert hall, but right to his front yard. The more he thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. She had tried to silence him with bureaucracy and hostility, and he would answer with music elevated to its highest form. Not just sound from a speaker, but harmonies that would carry down the street and turn his little home into a cathedral of holiday spirit. As plans began to solidify, he said nothing to the HOA. He let the letters keep coming, let her keep ranting to anyone who would listen. The quieter he stayed, the more convinced she became that she was winning. She strutted down the sidewalks with newfound arrogance, telling neighbors it was only a matter of time before the music stopped. But in truth, she was walking straight into her own undoing. When the contracts were signed and the date set, he felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge, though. It was about principle. It was about proving that joy doesn't have to shrink in the face of negativity. That sometimes, the best way to fight pettiness is not with silence, but with beauty so overwhelming that even anger can't stand against it. And so, as the week of Christmas approached, everything was ready. The lights were strung brighter than ever. The yard was groomed and prepared. The choir, a group of professional singers known for their breathtaking performances, was scheduled to arrive on the very night she believed she had finally silenced him. What she didn't know was that her greatest complaint was about to be met with a spectacle that would transform the neighborhood forever. The night chosen for the event was crisp, still and blanketed with the anticipation that always seems to hang in the air just before Christmas. The lights strung across his roof glowed like a beacon in the dark, their soft colors shimmering against the frosted lawns. To the casual passerby, it looked like a typical festive evening, just another decorated home in a row of identical suburban houses. But beneath the surface, preparations were underway for something far larger, something no one on the block could have predicted. The woman who had started the entire battle, the self-appointed guardian of silence, had grown smug in recent days. She had paraded her confidence with every step, her words dripping with certainty that the music would soon cease entirely. She had even bragged that she was expecting the HOA's final warning that week, the one that would silence the yard once and for all. To her, victory was inevitable, and yet she had no idea what was coming. Neighbors stepped outside in growing numbers, drawn by the sound. Families gathered on driveways, clutching steaming mugs of cocoa. Teenagers wandered closer, their phones already raised to capture the moment. Cars slowed as they passed, their drivers leaning out of windows to watch. Within minutes, what had begun as a simple performance became a spectacle, an impromptu concert under the winter sky. The woman appeared soon after, her steps sharp, her expression already brimming with outrage. She had been waiting for silence. Instead, she was met with a wall of sound so magnificent it seemed to drown out her very presence. Her mouth opened, no doubt to unleash another tirade, but her words were swallowed whole by the swell of music. The choir moved seamlessly from one carol to another. their voices carrying down the block, past the neat hedges and uniform driveways, out into the wider neighborhood. Phones recorded everything. Clips began spreading across social media almost immediately, neighbors tagging each other, laughing at the sheer audacity of the performance. Within an hour, the story had already begun to ripple beyond the street, curious viewers tuning in to see the suburban showdown play out in real time. For the woman, the humiliation was unbearable. She stormed up and down the sidewalk, pointing furiously toward the singers, gesturing toward the man's home as though summoning invisible reinforcements. She called out to anyone nearby. The HOA board members arrived before long, summoned by her urgent calls. They came expecting a simple noise dispute, perhaps another round of speaker music. Instead, they were confronted with a scene they could neither control nor easily condemn. A full choir legally performing on private property, surrounded by dozens of supportive neighbors, with cameras capturing every moment. The board members stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, clutching folders and papers that suddenly felt meaningless. The performance went on for over an hour. Carols filled the night, moving from the bright and cheerful to the soft and reverent, each song layering upon the last until the street itself seemed transformed. For that brief span of time, the block ceased to be just another suburban neighborhood. It became a gathering place, a celebration, a reminder of the power of community when joy is shared instead of suppressed. The HOA board, too, would not simply disappear. Though they had been powerless in the moment, their silence did not mean acceptance. They thrived on rules, regulations, and bureaucracy. The man could already imagine them convening behind closed doors, crafting new language, inventing new restrictions, searching for any angle to reassert their authority. The woman would not let this go. The HOA would not let this go. And he, standing firm in his belief that joy belongs to everyone, would not let them win. The next chapter of this suburban showdown was already writing itself. The days following the choir's performance were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. For years, the block had been a quiet, almost lifeless string of identical houses, each one painted in muted tones, each yard kept meticulously plain under the constant supervision of the homeowners association. But after that night, something had changed. The echoes of 30 voices still seemed to linger in the air, carried forward by memory and shared stories. Neighbors who had once passed each other without more than a nod now greeted one another warmly. Families who had never interacted exchanged recipes, shared snow shovels, and spoke of planning future gatherings. It was as if the performance had unlocked a sense of community, long buried beneath HOA rules, and the sharp disapproval of the woman who had fought hardest to keep joy from the street. But while the neighborhood spirit thrived, anger brewed in darker corners. Behind closed blinds, the woman seethed. Her humiliation had spread far beyond her street. Videos of the choir had circulated online, amassing tens of thousands of views. The title, "Karen Tries to Stop Christmas, Gets Drowned Out by a Choir," spread across platforms, inviting laughter, mockery, and endless commentary from strangers around the world. To her, it was intolerable. She had built her life around control, her identity tied to being the enforcer of order. Now she was the punchline in a joke too large to erase. The HOA board, too, had been rattled. Their authority, once unquestioned, had been openly defied and ridiculed. They had arrived expecting obedience, only to find themselves powerless against a crowd united in joy. Their folders of violations had looked flimsy compared to the spectacle of music and community. In their eyes, this was more than a neighborly squabble. It was a challenge to their very power. And so, in the cold days that followed, retaliation began to take form. Letters appeared in mailboxes, carefully typed and sealed with the HOA's emblem. The words inside were dripping with stern authority: new regulations restricting gatherings on private property, updated clauses about noise pollution, and vague warnings about potential legal consequences. They had written the rules in such a way that nearly anything, music, decorations, even yard activities, could be deemed a violation. It was not subtle. It was war disguised as paperwork. The woman walked the street with a renewed sense of purpose, her head held high once more, clutching copies of the notices as if they were proof of her restored dominance. She knocked on doors, reminding neighbors of fines and punishments. Her smirk had returned, fed by the thought that soon the house with the lights, the music, and the laughter would be silenced forever. But what she failed to realize was that the neighborhood was no longer hers to command. The choir had done more than perform songs, it had awakened a resistance. Neighbors who had once feared her scorn now stood taller. They had tasted freedom from her petty tyranny, and they had no intention of letting it go. The man at the center of it all did not panic. He read the letters, noted their contradictions, and quietly began preparing his response. He had always known the HOA's greatest weapon was intimidation. Their power came from convincing homeowners that rules were unshakable, that fines were unavoidable, that silence was the safest option. But beneath that facade was fragility. Rules could be challenged, fines could be contested, and intimidation lost its sting when people refused to cower. He gathered the letters, studied them carefully, and contacted those who understood the law better than the board itself. He learned of loopholes, of contradictions, of legal precedents that undermined the very regulations they were trying to enforce. And slowly he formed a plan, not of defiance alone but of decisive victory. The next weekend the stage was set once again. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation, whispers of something bigger than before spreading house to house. Children waited eagerly, adults exchanged excited glances, and even those who had previously kept to themselves ventured out with curiosity. When evening came, it was clear this would not be a repeat of the choir alone. From the moment the first guests arrived, the scale of the event became undeniable. It was not just neighbors this time. It was people from surrounding streets, families from across town who had seen the viral videos and wanted to witness the next chapter. Cars lined the road for blocks, headlights flickering in the cold night, local news vans parked nearby, cameras ready to capture whatever unfolded. The HOA's attempt to silence one man's joy had inadvertently turned his home into a public stage. And then the music began again. But it was not just the choir this time. The man had gone further. The choir returned, yes, their voices as powerful as ever. But alongside them were instrumentalists, a small brass section, violinists, even a percussion ensemble. Lights were arranged to illuminate the performance, casting a warm glow that spread across the crowd. The house itself became a backdrop, transformed into something resembling a concert hall in the middle of suburbia. The sound rose higher, fuller, more commanding than before. Carols gave way to powerful arrangements, songs layered with instruments and harmonies that seemed to shake the ground. The crowd cheered between numbers, clapping in rhythm, some even singing along. It was no longer just a performance, it was a festival. The turning point came when the man stepped forward between songs, holding not a microphone, but a single folder of his own. Inside were documents, permits, legal opinions, evidence that the HOA's new rules were not just overreaching but unenforceable. He had anticipated their retaliation and dismantled it piece by piece, leaving them powerless to act. Word spread quickly through the crowd. Whispers turned to cheers, cheers to chants. The HOA's authority, once so intimidating, crumbled before the sheer force of community standing united. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her protests drowned out not by music alone, but by the overwhelming sound of laughter, applause, and joy. The performance continued long into the night. Songs echoed across the neighborhood, lights shimmered against the winter sky, and the street became a symbol of defiance against pettiness. Families who had once hidden inside their homes now danced on the pavement. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, strangers hugging as though they had known each other for years. By the time the final note rang out, the battle was over. The HOA had been exposed for what it was, a fragile institution propped up by fear. The woman who had started it all retreated into silence, her window curtains drawn tight, her voice no longer carrying weight. And the man, once just another homeowner, had become something far greater. He was the symbol of resilience, the neighbor who proved that joy cannot be legislated away. In the weeks that followed, The story spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city, even beyond the state. News outlets picked it up, calling it the suburban Christmas revolution. The viral videos climbed into the millions of views, strangers across the world cheering on the man who had turned a petty complaint into a global story of defiance. Tourists began visiting the block, taking photos with the house that had hosted the choir, eager to stand where the drama had unfolded. Local businesses offered sponsorships for future events. The city itself recognized the street with an award for community spirit, cementing the transformation from a quiet, rule-bound neighborhood into a landmark of joy. And so the man's victory was not just personal, it was communal, it was cultural. He had taken the smallest of grievances, a complaint about music, and turned it into a celebration that united hundreds, inspired thousands, and entertained millions. The woman faded into obscurity, her power broken, her name remembered only as a footnote in the viral videos that mocked her outrage. The HOA, too, was forced to retreat, their attempts at control scrutinized, their influence weakened by the public eye. What remained was the music, the laughter, the community that had been born in the glow of Christmas lights and the sound of a choir's harmony. The story ended not with silence, but with song. A reminder to all who heard it that joy, once shared, becomes unstoppable.